Morning. Hopefully you grabbed, along with the notes, one of the little handy-dandy drawings that were back there with them. If you need that, get a hold of one of those. I have it on the board up here, but there's a bunch of stuff on the diagram. Sorry for the people that are live streaming that watch it on the board. I was thinking about this morning. It came to me last night too. But it all fits into where we were last week, looking at foundation material, 1 Corinthians chapters 1 through 6. That really gets us to 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and so on. It's crucial because without the foundation, we have a tendency, because it's our nature, to look at the scriptures, try to turn it into law. That gets us into all kinds of trouble. So on the diagram, again, if you take from Genesis to Revelation, you can take the biblical story and put it in this little picture. It goes like this. God created mankind to be right there with him, to walk with him, his entire existence, to walk with him. The enemy came along and got man to believe what he had to say, and mankind became subject to what we can call the spirit of disobedience. There's a lot of other things we could put up there, law being one of them, the independent spirit. But when Adam and Eve took of the forbidden fruit, where the enemy said to them, you can be like God if you eat this fruit. In other words, if you eat this, you don't need him. They became subject to the spirit of disobedience, and every human being born into this world is born into this condition. God knew that was going to happen. God had a plan in place, and God's plan of redemption is to restore humanity back to a relationship with him. That's the biblical story. That's the biblical story right there. We were created to walk with God. We chose to choose a different path, to walk under a different lordship. God's plan of redemption, bring us back. So, wherever you open up the scriptures, it's telling us that story. And it's important to know that, because in Paul's letters, this is what he's talking about. This is behind everything. Of all the biblical writings, this is behind it. This is the backdrop. This is the foundation. And without it, we will misinterpret and then misapply what the writers are telling us. Now, on your papers, I'm not going to write it up here on the wall because my handwriting is terrible. You can see that based on the paper. Under these two conditions, there are characteristics associated with being under this spirit of disobedience, and there are characteristics of being under the spirit of obedience. My list is not exhaustive. I only want to point out some because they have to do with 1 Corinthians. When we talk about the spirit of disobedience, there are characteristics associated with it. Hierarchy, the pyramid structure, who gets to rule. That's a characteristic of that spirit of disobedience. I want to be over everybody else. I want to be in control. That's part of that. To protect self at all costs. It's why I want to be in control. Because I'm trying to protect me. I don't want to die. I'm afraid of dying. That's another characteristic. And associated with that is a fear of lack. If I don't have enough, I think I'm going to die. And because of that, I want to be in control so that if you have something that I think I need, I can take it from you. Because I'm in control after all. My life is more important than yours. Over there, there's the avoidance of hardship. Because in our minds, hardship equates to loss and death. So we try to avoid hardship. But also over here, there is no devotion to God. There's no asking God for anything. And over here, then the first part of Galatians 5, the works of the flesh we find over here. Anger, murder, hatred, all that stuff. Now, over here, under the spirit of obedience, there's also characteristics. The sacrifice of self, putting others above me. Love, loving others, serving others, a devotion to God, being a follower of Jesus. And the fruit of the Spirit are all characteristics of this list over here. And if we just start comparing the two lists, we see that they are dramatically different. And all of that comes into play because when Paul starts his letter to the church at Corinth, he says, guys, you guys are playing this game of hierarchy. Who was baptized by who? Because one of you wants to play superior. They're over here. This also is what he refers to as the carnal mind. Sorry. The carnal mind. Should have just left it alone. That's the carnal mind. It's thinking like the world thinks and acting and making decisions based upon those things. So, let's get into today's study, page 1 of the notes. So last week we were talking about a bunch of foundational material. We looked at 1 Corinthians chapter 6 as Paul's example of who they were making decisions by. Whose voice were they listening to? And again, that's the issue here. Whose voice am I paying attention to make the decisions of my life? The significant decisions as well as the mundane. And the problem that we find ourselves often in is because we were born into this condition, we make all kinds of daily decisions without even thinking about whose voice we're listening to. It's just what has become habit over here. It's just what we do. The problem with that is that keeps us somewhat connected into this realm. When the Spirit of God in redemption wants to drag us completely away from that realm and back into a relationship with God. So we're constantly dealing with that, and we deal with it in the church all the time, the church of Corinth. All the churches Paul wrote to were dealing with this in some format. It hasn't changed. We're still there. We don't have to stay there. That's Paul's point. And he's calling them to take even the simple decisions of life and ask God about them. Begin that practice of just asking God about what's going on. So, chapters 1 through chapter 6 of 1 Corinthians is actually foundation material, talking to us about this, talking to us about making our daily decisions, who we're going to listen to get us to the other things that Paul's going to write about beginning in chapter 7. But what's behind all of this is this picture. Now, I find it interesting that in chapter 6, Paul's talking to the people and he says, how come when you have a feud with somebody else, you go out here to the world's courts to get decisions? Why aren't you going to the church? Why aren't you going to people who will ask God what he has to say? Why is it you keep doing this? And his point is because you're carnal. This is where you just tend to live instead of developing that relationship. I find it interesting that chapter 7 begins with, and regarding the things you wrote me about. So in chapter 6, Paul says, how come you don't go to anybody who's going to ask God for the answers? And in chapter 7 he says, there are some things you did ask me about. And that's how he starts it. So let's look at chapter 7, page 2 of the notes. This is going to be an exercise that, again, involves all of these things that Paul talked about in chapters 1 through 6, and it includes this picture. Being conformed to the image of Christ, being restored to a oneness relationship with God, walking with God, that's behind everything. And we have to remember that because Paul alludes to it, but he doesn't spell it out. but this is what's going on. And it helps us understand what he has to say. Chapter 7, verse 1, now concerning the things of which you wrote to me, it's good for a man not to touch a woman. Well, isn't that a handy place to start? By the way, I know you guys wrote to me about all kinds of things. Here's what I have to say first. It's good for a man not to touch a woman. Now that ought to stop us right there. Because this whole chapter is dealing with issues about marriage that God in Genesis instituted. So why would Paul begin his whole conversation here with a statement so bold that's contradictory to what God had to say at the beginning? Why does he say that? He develops it. Let's look at verse 2. Nevertheless, because of sexual immorality, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. Now, what's intriguing about chapter 7 is the whole way through, it looks like Paul is anti-marriage. But he's not. Let's get that right across the table. Paul is not against marriage. Understand at the very beginning why Paul says what he says. Because Paul is looking at this picture, writing to the church at Corinth who's stuck over here in carnality, meaning they function, a large portion of their lives, they live based upon what the world tells them. But Paul's writing from the perspective, God's plan of salvation is to bring you back to himself. What Paul unfolds, and we're going to look at all these different pieces because this is where the church gets so messed up with this. And we argue and we feud and we fight and we separate. Paul is starting his answers from the perspective that you and I as individuals are to be developing a walk with God. And he starts with the idea that if all I have to be concerned about in this earth is me, I can concentrate fully on God. That's the background to everything he's going to say. And I'm going to point this out as we go through here. So he starts off by saying, it would be better if a man doesn't touch a woman. In other words, what he's talking about is if a man doesn't have a wife. Nevertheless, because of sexual immorality, in other words, yes, God created marriage. God designed the whole idea of procreating and having children and raising them in a relationship with God so that God's family expands. Paul knows that, and he's in full support of it. But he says when it comes to spiritual development, because that's what he's been talking about in chapters 1 through 6, when it comes to getting out of the world and back in a relationship with God, it's easier to do that if I only have to worry about me. That's not elevating self. It's simply a practical matter. That if I don't have any attachments in this earthly realm, I can devote my life to walking with God. Again, understand where Paul's at. Paul says, I can go wherever and whenever God says go here. I am free to do that. Now again, it comes across as though he's against marriage, but he's not. But he goes on and says, but for the sake of sexual immorality, in other words, if you do the physical things between man and woman outside of marriage, that's immoral. So if there's a compulsion, then get married. It's okay. Now, underlining in that is you should process who you're going to marry. Because if this movement out of the world back to God is the primary purpose, that's the primary essence of life from God's point of view, then who I marry ought to have the same objective. Because if they don't, it's going to keep getting in the way of my journey and your journey. Verse 3, let the husband render to his wife the affection due her, and likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does, and likewise the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another except with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer and come together again so that Satan does not tempt you because of the lack of your self-control. What's he talking about? Don't operate in the carnal mind in your marriage. Remember, what's the characteristics over here? I get to be in control. Well, now I'm married to a wife. Well, what's her mindset if she's over here? I get to be in control. Right? So Paul is writing to them and saying, look, when you get married, don't function in the carnal mind. And if you take a break from the earthly sexual relationship, do it for the sake of both of you, what? Seeking God. See, there it is again. Paul says there's the objective. Walking closer to Him. So if you're going to deprive one another, do it consensually for the purpose of prayer and fasting to draw closer to God. It's not a weapon. That's this mentality over here. Verse 6, but I say this as a concession, not as a commandment. You say this as a concession. What? That it's okay to marry. It's not a commandment that you have to marry. It's a concession. How do I know that's what he's saying? Because of verse 7, for I wish that all men were even as I myself. Paul says, look, I don't have a problem with marriage. It's okay. But if you're going to develop your relationship with God, you can do it easier if you're alone. So Paul says, I just look at it and say, I know who I am, and I can just keep working on that relationship. Because what's the primary objective? To love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. And if there's things about the world that I'm attached to in any kind of form, even if it's okay by God, it just, Paul uses these words and it frustrates me because we always look at them negatively. It's a hindrance to my development with my relationship with God. The world gets in the way of that. I got to get through this sermon today, so please. Or I'm going to go home and be in a lot of trouble. Verse 7 again, top of page 3. For I wish that all men were even as myself, but each one has his own gift from God, one in this manner and another in that. You understand what Paul's saying? I understand from the world's perspective in developing a relationship with God, it's easier if you're single. But God has a gift for each one. And God's gift for you could be a spouse. For somebody else, could be to stay single. God's the one who chooses. Again, look at what he's doing. He's pointing right back over here. And he says, I have thoughts on the subject, but the one who's going to tell you is him. Whether you stay single, whether you get married, that answer should come from God. Not the world. It comes from God. Now understand, he changes now who he's talking to. Verse 8, but I say to the unmarried and to the widows, it is good for them if they remain even as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, let them marry, for it's better to marry than to burn with passion. He's saying the same thing he did just earlier. He's writing to the widows, he's writing to the unmarried, and he says, look, if you can stay that way, from my perspective, in developing your relationship with God, that's a good thing. But if the desire within your heart is to have a spouse, that's okay. And it's better to get married than to carry that burden around with you. Because the enemy's going to use that burden. Let me reiterate, Paul is not against marriage. And he's not saying that marriage is sin. And we know that because God's the one who instituted it. What Paul is dealing with is a church who's living too much according to what the world is telling it, and not enough in a relationship with God, and he's trying to direct their attention back there. This is where you need to get your answers from. One point in my life, I supervised a group of women workers. And if one of them started having an issue at home and started hanging around with somebody that was divorced, I could guarantee you it wasn't going to be long, they were going to be divorced. Because the characteristics of this over here, I get to be in control. I get to rule. So just cut the ties. Some examples in the scriptures. In the genealogy of Jesus, after he's born, his parents take him to the temple in Luke. And we find two people there. Simeon, a man who was just and devout. Devout respective to what? God. And we find Anna, who had been married for several years and then had been a widow for 85 or 84. And what do we read about Anna? Where did she spend her entire life, her widowhood? In the temple, serving God. That's what Paul's talking about. If you can do that, do that. If you want another spouse, it's okay. He's just writing from the perspective of developing a relationship with God. Now, again, let me reiterate, simply because we fall into this trap, because we love to look at Corinthians, this chapter in particular, and we want to make it law. Paul's not writing law. There's all kinds of unknowns in Paul's writing. There's all kinds of scenarios he doesn't cover. And we're really good at creating them. Paul's not writing law. He's simply directing their attention to God. It says, look, walking with God is easier if you're alone. Back in the year 2000, when God called me to stop being a pastor without an occupation and to take a walk with him to learn that he's faithful, let me tell you how many times I thought this would be easier if I didn't have a wife and 2 little kids that need provided for. Because their needs were constantly on my mind. I understand what Paul's talking about here. But what he wants us to understand is don't fall into the trap of law. Paul understands the challenges of being single. He understands the challenges of being married. He is simply trying to help these believers get out of this mindset to develop a relationship with God. Page 4 of the notes. Now, my Bible and a lot of Bibles put these little subtitles on, and they drive me nuts. Because often they play into our mentality of law, and we miss what God is saying. For instance, at the beginning, right before verse 10, my Bible says, keep your marriage vows. But I'm not convinced that's exactly what Paul's actually writing about. But let's unfold it. Verse 10, now to the married. Okay, here we go. Paul's shifting his audience. He just wrote to the unmarried and the widows. Now he's writing to the married. Now to the married I command, yet not I but the Lord. A wife is not to depart from her husband, but even if she does depart, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband, and a husband is not to divorce his wife. Now I'll unpack some more behind this in a moment, but let's draw our attention again. What is, according to Genesis, the first reason for marriage? If I've ever married you, you should know this. Sorry, if I've ever officiated your marriage, you should know this. Bringing people back to God. God says to Adam, Adam's over here with God. God puts a tree in the garden and says, don't have anything to do with that tree. The very next thing God says, it's not good for man to be alone. Why? Because you put Tim in a room with something he's not supposed to play with and leave, and Tim is going to play with it. The very next thing that God does is create Eve, a helpmeet. And I've explained this many times. That word means to come to the aid of and to surround. Eve's first purpose is to keep Adam in his relationship with God and away from that tree. You say, oh no, it's to procreate. Folks, there's no good reason to procreate if you're not walking with God. Eve's first objective is to keep Adam in the relationship with God. And if he starts heading for the tree, Adam, turn around. And to get between Adam and the tree if necessary. You can't do this, Adam. You've got to get your eyes back on God. That's the primary role. That's the mindset that Paul is writing to the married. A wife shouldn't depart from her husband. And if she does, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. And a husband is not to divorce his wife. Why? Because they're there to help one another. That's the objective. To walk this path together. That's the point. So it comes down to, should I marry? Ask God. If God says yes, then first off, choose a spouse who's going to help walk that walk. And when you find that spouse, you treat each other properly, righteously, fruit of the Spirit, lovingly, putting them above yourself, sacrificing yourself for their sake. not like the world, who wants to play who's in charge. I've been in way too many churches where that game is still being played. Tell my wife she has to obey me. Sorry. Keep that under control or the pet peeves will start coming out. What Paul is saying is, look, if you're married, fulfill your responsibility to your spouse of what? Seeking God. That's the primary purpose. That's the primary purpose. Verse 12, but to the rest, wonder who the rest is. But to the rest, I, not the Lord, say. Now, it's interesting to me that Paul does this over and over, too, through this chapter. Here's what God says. Oh, by the way, here's my opinion on the matter. Which is why we have to be listening. What is God telling us? But to the rest, if any brother, notice the term, if any brother, Paul's talking about a believing person, believing man, has a wife who does not believe. We get the scenario? We have a believing man and a wife who's not a believer. Now again, we generate all these scenarios. Well, was that the condition when they got married or when they could become a believer after they got? I don't know. It doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. If any brother has a wife who does not believe, now notice the criteria here, and she is willing to live with him, let him not divorce her. And if a woman who has a husband who does not believe, if he is willing to live with her, let her not divorce him. Why? Because the unbelieving spouse is not hindering your walk with God. They're willing to live with you. They don't have a problem with you spending time with God, praying, studying the Scriptures. They're okay with that. Do you understand that that can be a benefit of helping lead them to God? Because they're willing. They're not standing back there. How come you're going to church? Oh, you're all the time going to church. Why don't you ever stay home with me? Blah, blah. They're not doing that. They're supportive of the believer's walk with God. That's what Paul's talking about. And he says, if that's the condition, don't divorce them. Because you can have a major impact on their life. Verse 14, for the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Otherwise your children would be unclean, but now they are holy. What he's saying is the believing spouse is having a dramatic influence on the whole rest of the family in this direction towards God. Because the unbelieving spouse is willing, is okay with, is supportive of your walk with God. So don't play the game of, well, they just don't believe I'm going to divorce them. No. Just don't do that. Have we forgotten that God does, in fact, make the two one? And when he makes the two one, the believing spouse has a dramatic influence, especially in this condition where the unbeliever is willing, is okay, it's all right. Verse 15, but if the unbeliever departs, let him depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. For how do you know, O wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, O husband, whether you will save your wife? So Paul takes it now to a different place. He says, basically, if the unbeliever isn't willing to stay with you and chooses to leave, let them leave. Why? Because it's the loving thing to do. Again, imagine this scenario. You're a believer, your spouse isn't, and they aren't willing to walk with you. And I know that because they want to leave. They're not willing to stay. They want to leave. Now again, start imagining in your mind, what are you going to do as the believer if we make this law? If we turn what Paul says into law, no, you have to stay. You understand there's going to be a fight real fast. And while you're fighting over who gets to make the decision, both of you are out here. And Paul says, what do you think your chances are of helping the unbelieving spouse find God if you're out here with them fighting out here? There should rather be peace. If they want to go, let them go. Why? Because you're walking with God. God's got us covered. Whatever my need may be, if that person leaves, God's still here. He hasn't gone anywhere. But stay in this relationship and stay under these characteristics instead of going back out here. Paul says you don't know if you'll turn their heart. Especially if they want out. Let them go. It's a loving thing to do. I found myself in this situation, not in a marriage relationship, but as a pastor of a church. Another church had an incredible, vibrant youth group going. And youth in the church that I was pastoring were going to that youth group. Now, I could have gotten up in arms. It's like, no, this is my church. You're staying here. You're part of... The loving thing was let them go. And most of them have become incredible believers and doing things for God. And the thing that God kept speaking to my heart was the loving thing is let them go. Support them in that. It's okay. Because the goal is not to keep them here. This is what Paul's talking about here in the marriage relationship. Page 5 of the notes. Now, if you read through chapter 7, there's a lot of scenarios that can come up in our minds that Paul doesn't answer. Because what Paul is really addressing is it's keeping our relationship with God going and maturing. Now, beginning in verse 17, it seems like Paul is shifting. But he's not, because he comes back to the issue of marriage a couple verses later. But let's read through these next couple verses. Verse 17, page 5. But as God has distributed to each one, as the Lord has called each one, so let him walk. And so I ordain in all the churches. So Paul's kind of summarizing what he's just said about marriage. That some people God will have them remain single. Some people God will give them spouses. That's the way God works. It's okay. Ask him. He'll tell you. But then he flips a little bit. But again, it's the same idea. We'll talk about it here. Was anyone called while circumcised? Let him not become uncircumcised. Was anyone called while uncircumcised? Let him not be circumcised. Circumcision is nothing and uncircumcision is nothing, but keeping the commandments of God is what matters. Let each one remain in the same calling in which he was called. Now understand that when Paul uses the term called, he's talking about that moment of God calling us to become a believer, a follower of his. So Paul says, when you become a believer, remain in the condition you're in. So if you were circumcised, it's okay. If you're uncircumcised, you don't need to be circumcised. Why? Because that's law. What's the important thing? Not circumcision, not uncircumcision. The important thing is keeping the commands of God, walking with him. That's the important thing. Verse 21, were you called while a slave? Do not be concerned about it. But if you can make yourself free, rather use it. Oh, there's another one of those. Okay. For he who is called in the Lord while a slave is the Lord's freedman. Likewise, he who is called while free is Christ's slave. You were bought at a price. Do not become slaves of men. Brethren, let each one remain with God in the state in which he was called. So, Paul throws out these two next scenarios, circumcision and slavery, but he's only kind of talking about that. He's talking about the whole marriage thing. In other words, did you become a believer while you were married? Don't change. Did you become a believer when you were single? There's no demand that you have to get married. It's okay if you do. That's what everything before it says. But don't feel like, well, okay, if a spouse is going to help me grow in my relationship with God, because that's Genesis chapter 2, then obviously I need to get married. No. Paul's saying, don't feel like you have to change your condition simply because you became a believer. So Paul had talked to the married. He had then talked about a different version of marriage. He talked to the unmarried and the widows, and now he's coming back to that in verse 25. Now concerning virgins, I have no commandment from the Lord, yet I give a judgment as one whom the Lord in his mercy has made trustworthy. Again, Paul's not being flippant here. He's making a point. God doesn't have a specific command, law, about this issue. Because each one of us walks in a unique relationship with God. So there's not a law that covers everything. Concerning virgins, I suppose, therefore, that this is good because of the present distress, that it's good for a man to remain as he is. Now, we don't know what the present distress is that Paul's talking about. We speculate as to when we think this letter was written, and within probably 12 years or so, Nero takes over and goes on a rampage against believers. I don't know if that's what Paul's talking about. We could look at it in our day and say, we know that Revelation is coming. We know that trying times are coming. We know that. So Paul looks at it from that perspective. You and I can look at it from the thing of Revelation. And imagine the challenges of being married and having a family when the things of Revelation start to unfold. It doesn't mean we shouldn't. Just imagine the difference. So from that perspective, Paul's looking at it and saying, look, because there's a lot of distress in the world when it comes to a man or a woman who isn't married, a virgin, Paul says, I suppose it's probably better if they remain single. But then listen to verse 27. Again, it gets back to this whole issue of the state in which you were called. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be loosed. Are you loosed from a wife? Do not seek a wife. You see, he's using the idea of circumcision and slavery to help set up what he's going to talk about to those who are unmarried and those who are married. It seems when you read through it, it's like, Paul, where in the world are you going with all this? But if we understand that everything Paul's saying is dealing with this picture and this movement out of the world system into a relationship with God, that's what's behind everything that Paul writes. And again, he's simply saying, look, if you became a believer when you were single, don't feel like you have to go find a wife. And if you became a believer when you were married, don't feel like you got to get rid of the wife. That's the world's thinking. But even if you do marry, you have not sinned. And if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. Nevertheless, such will have trouble in the flesh, but I would spare you. Again, this is simply a father talking to his children. How many times I've had these conversations with my own kids? Not about marriage, but just about life's decisions. If you take out a car loan, you're going to be bound to that thing. It would be so much better if you didn't do that. I understand it's the way of the world, and yes, you need a vehicle, and blah, 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 and okay. But man, it would be so much better if you didn't. That's what Paul's talking about here. He's simply saying, look, when I look at the world around me, and I see what's going on, and I think about moving people in a relationship with God, boy, the more ways that you could unattach from the world. The subject just happens to be marriage at the moment. But the more that you could unattach from the world, man, so much easier that's going to be. Again, I remember growing up, and the American dream was buy a house, be a homeowner. Nobody ever told me it's a big boat anchor. Because the more you become a homeowner, yeah, it owns you. And Lynn and I were talking about that again last night. If God told me right now, Tim, I want you from here over there, I'd say, about a year and a half, God, and I'll get there. Because I got to deal with all these attachments. This is what Paul's talking about. Again, it's weird because he's talking about marriage, and that bothers us. But he's simply saying, man, based on what's coming. But he's not telling them one way or the other. His point is, ask God what he wants you doing. This is why Paul's not giving a definitive answer, and he's not covering every scenario in the book. He's just saying, look, if the more you get attached in any form in the world, when distress comes, there's just going to be a lot of suffering there. Top of page 6. The time's running out. Verse 29, but this I say, brethren, the time is short, so that from now on even those who have wives should be as though they had none. Those who weep as though they did not weep. Those who rejoice as they did not rejoice. Those who buy as though they did not possess. And those who use this world as not misusing it. For the form of this world is passing away, but I want you to be without care. Now again, Paul is in no way advocating divorce here at all. What he is saying to this body of believers, and what God is saying to you and I, is we have got to detach ourselves from this world's system. Because the more we're attached to this, the harder it's going to be when distress comes. We already know this. Things break down and it costs money to fix them. Most people get distressed about that. And if you didn't have that thing, then it doesn't matter if it breaks down, because it's not bothering you because you don't have it to begin with. That's what Paul's talking about. He says, guys, look, the point is, get detached from the world. Get attached to God. He summed it up here. He who is unmarried cares for the things of the Lord, how he may please the Lord. But he who is married cares about the things of the world, how he may please his wife. Again, Paul's not against marriage. He is just speaking about a reality. This is why also it becomes so important that we marry someone that has the same outlook about God. Because otherwise, man, it's a rough road to hoe. Trying to develop a relationship with God when there's somebody you're attached to that isn't interested. He goes on, therefore, there's a difference between a wife and a virgin. The unmarried woman cares about the things of the Lord, that she may be holy both in body and spirit. But she who is married cares about the things of the world, how she may please her husband. And this I say for your own benefit, not that I may put a leash on you, but for what is proper, that you may serve the Lord without distraction. Again, it's rough because Paul uses language that makes it sound like marriage is a negative thing, and that's not his point. His point simply is, here's the whole picture. Or to be developing a relationship with God. We have trouble hearing the Spirit because we're so bound to the world. And there's lots of voices speaking to us. How much more a spouse speaking to us, and especially if they're not supportive, or if they're extra bound to the world, or whatever, we just stay attached out here because there's things you have to do. You get married, you have kids, there's things in the world you have to do. Things you have to take care of. Necessities you have to provide for. It's just different. And again, Paul's not against any of that. He is simply trying to communicate when it comes to walking with God. Any attachment to the world system can be a hindrance. Can be. Doesn't have to be. It can be. Verse 36. I'm going to finish this out here. But if any man thinks he's behaving improperly toward his virgin, if she's past the flower of youth, and thus it must be, let him do what he wishes. He does not sin, let them marry. Nevertheless, he who stands steadfast in his heart, having no necessity, but has power over his own will, and has so determined in his heart that he will keep his virgin, does well. So then he who gives her in marriage does well, but he who does not give her in marriage does better. A wife is bound by law as long as her husband lives, but if her husband dies, she's at liberty to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. But she is happier if she remains as she is according to my judgment, and I think I also have the Spirit of God. Paul's just communicating the same message in different venues of life, and just says, look, if you're engaged to somebody and you want to marry, marry. If you want to remain single, that's okay too. There's benefits to both, but our answer has to come from God. That's the overall point. Now here's some of the things that I gleaned out of this as I was going through it, and that is, we make decisions in the earthly realm, especially regarding marriage, and then we go to chapters like this trying to validate our decision. That's part of the problem. Because there is nowhere in here does Paul validate divorce. It's not there. He says if so-and-so wants to leave, let him leave. But there are all these other conditions that you and I know occur in the earthly realm, in marriages. But understand, those situations are not here in this text. Where do we get our answers for those? From God. Don't go to 1 Corinthians trying to find the answer regarding an abusive marriage, because it's not in there. The answer is here. So all these different scenarios that pop up, the truth is they're not in here. Because that's not why Paul wrote this chapter. He wrote this chapter to try and help believers who are too bound to the world to get separated from the world and continue developing the relationship with God. That's why it was written. Everybody okay? Stand with me this morning. Father in heaven, we thank you, Lord, that you are faithful to tell us truth. We just pray, Lord, you will continue to guide us in it, that we might understand it correctly, that we might apply it appropriately, Lord God. We do thank you and praise you for, Lord, this word today. Lord, help us receive it and meditate upon it and let you speak to our hearts. In Jesus' name, amen.